Heard of him before, and I talked to him for about 40 minutes. And on the 31st of January, it was on the front page of the New York Times. And then the furore began.
The anthropologists were stunned by the New York Times article and stunned again by the immediate press attention to it. We're talking about dispatches that were printed in literally hundreds of newspapers throughout the United States, not on one day, but for day after day. It had the kind of attention that presidential candidates or presidents are accustomed to have, altogether unusual for an academic subject. And they didn't have the book. They had no indication that such a book was in progress, and nor, when it was announced, had anybody heard of Derek Freeman. Who is Derek Freeman? And it looked like a case in which the most honored anthropologist in history, indeed one of the most honored Americans and academics in history, was to be slain by an obscure David somewhere out in the Antipodes. Coming of Age Samoa was a classic textbook for undergraduate teaching. Millions, who knows, 5, 10 million Americans may have read that as undergraduates in universities. And of course it was taught to them as being true. And then along comes Derek Freeman and says it's all false.
What Derek did, you see, was a double whammy. He didn't just attack it in a theoretical way. He attacked it in the person of the goddess, of the super celebrity who had made anthropology, who was the symbol of anthropology to the world, and who was the prime promulgator of this doctrine to the world on behalf of anthropology. So he did a thing that was doubly bad. He didn't just say, you know, this religion is theologically problematical. And he said God is wrong. Or rather, in this case, the goddess is wrong. She couldn't be, you see. She couldn't be, because if she was wrong, then the doctrine was wrong, then the whole liberal humanitarian scheme was wrong. Now, I think this is a wrong connection. I think the liberal wing here made a wrong connection. You don't need that position in order to defend the goodness of man. But they do, and they did.
One of the leading anthropologists came out immediately after the first word of Derek's book was out and said, I haven't read the book, but I know he's wrong. That's a bit depressing in a field that thinks it's a science.
The controversy of nature-nurture was an important one which should have been dealt with in his book, but wasn't dealt with because he was so interested in ruining the reputation that Margaret Mead had built on her Samoa work.
I think that there was a kind of spirit of, oh boy, let's do some debunking. That'll be fun. That ended when people realized that this wasn't just Margaret Mead bashing, that this was an attack on the fundamental ideas of the discipline.
I've had some anthropologists say to me that it wasn't good for the discipline as a whole. And I said, why not? Why not? If we can't stand scrutiny, then what are we worried about? I'm not worried about being scrutinized. Saying, yeah, so, well, that was wrong. So look at everything we've done right.
This came at a time when there was a backlash on cultural determinism or explaining things in terms of environment in this country. It was a political backlash. Out comes this book which supports a right-wing political backlash and gives reason why, in fact, we should be following biologically based national policies. So that's extremely threatening. I'm not sure he was aware of that he was used or could have been used if his book had sold.
Well, I'm a little concerned as a university professor because some of my students tell me that in their anthropology classes, they are almost actively discouraged from reading Freeman's book, which I find absolutely extraordinary. Because I have heard anthropology colleagues speak critically of Margaret Mead, but it's as though they are frightened that their discipline will come under discredit by this book, and let's face it, I think they're a little nervous about getting grants.
It so happened that in November 1983, in Science 83, which is a publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, my book was rated as the most important book of the year in the social sciences and recommended for holiday reading. Now, at this very time, the American Anthropological Association was meeting in Chicago, its annual meeting. And there, the opposition to my refutation was so intense that a motion was passed condemning the book as unscientific and as possessing all other kinds of defects. And they then voted on it. This is a quite extraordinary event because the scientific truth is something that cannot be settled politically. It's something that depends on the evidence. And I realized when this news reached me that my refutation, in fact, had been a great success because it had prompted these people into this quite extraordinary reaction.
American anthropologists knew very little about Derek Freeman as a person and didn't realize what they were taking on. I think they felt a few dismissive reviews and he would curl up and die and go away and retire back to Poga Poga or Bonga Bonga or wherever it was he'd come from. They didn't realize they were taking on a very, very tough character. I mean, anyone who knows Derek knows that when he has got his teeth into something, he does not let go. He is going to get it right, though the heavens fall. So American anthropology suddenly found itself with this one-man tornado taking it on. And for every 20 indignant letters or articles, the American anthropologists or speeches, Derek came back with 20 more equally powerful. And I think this has rather shaken them. I think they weren't prepared for something of this magnitude. They just thought he'd go away. Well, Derek doesn't just go away.
In 1973, Richard Goodman, a student of Samoa for many years, writes his own independent refutation of Mead's book. He arrives at many of the same conclusions that Freeman reaches.
Well, what I uncovered was that Samoans have a huge amount of aggression in them due to the way they're brought up as children, treated as children, punished as children, that they repress this aggression and anger, that they displace it. It comes out in very interesting and peculiar ways. They simply aren't that happy. They have a mask of happiness.
In the area in Samoa that I lived, there was one occasion of extraordinary violence, which happened in the national cricket tournament in Apia, in the capital city. Our team went to the cricket tournament, and they were not doing very well in the cricket tournament, and they thought they should be doing better. In one game, they became enraged by the referee's calls. They thought they were biased, and the crowd began yelling, "Kill the ref," and they did. They beat him to death with their cricket bats. One occurrence that I have read about, I believe it was in 1928, a very similar occurrence happened in Apia in the national cricket tournament when a referee was beaten to death by the players with their cricket bats for bad calls. Exactly the same thing that happened in 1982.
When I was in Samoa in 1967, I was astonished to find that an American anthropologist, Lowell Holmes, had claimed that Mead's conclusions about Samoa were remarkably reliable. I had a copy of his PhD thesis. In fact, he had sent me a copy of it. I then wrote to him and pointed out that the information contained in this thesis on rape and various other things directly contradicted Margaret Mead. And I asked him how this possibly could be, that when his own evidence contradicted her, he could claim that her conclusions were remarkably reliable. And he wrote back to me in 1967 saying that he agreed that Margaret found pretty much what she wanted to find and that he disagreed with various of her conclusions, but he was forced by his faculty advisor to soften his criticisms. And in this same letter,